So, welcome. We're doing a roundtable discussion today titled, you'll see in your program, Information plus Activism, How to Navigate Social Media, the Media, and the Truth. Since we're here with so many people engaged in activism of some sort, and we're focusing on truth, we thought it might be fun to have a conversation about where people obtain their knowledge and information in the world of media and how this shapes our culture and our laws. I grew up, like most people, over the age of 30. Yeah, 30. In the room, believing that the news that was reported out on respected news outlets, like the network news and in our local Cleveland newspapers. But these are very different times. Although it's interesting when reading some quotes from the past 100 years, it seems that it might have only been the masses who bought into the idea of truth in the media. This is a quote from Edward Bernays from Propaganda. He says, "The conscious and intelligent manipulation of the organized habits and opinions of the masses is an important element in democratic society. Those who manipulate this unseen mechanism of society constitute an invisible government, which is the true ruling power of our country. We are governed, our minds are molded, our tastes formed, our ideas suggested, largely by men we have never heard of. It is they who pull the wires which control the public mind." And he wrote that in 1928. And just another one, this is a real short one from Joseph Goebbels, you might know that name, who got to the point more bluntly. He said, "Let me control the media, and I will turn any nation into a herd of pigs." So, on that note, we're going to make this just a casual conversation between friends. We have Chad Nicholson over here, who's replacing Valerie. A lot of you know him.
No.
He agreed to step up. Chad, as you know, is the Director of Community Resilience and Resistance for CELDF. He has been with us for how many years?
Since 2009.
Okay. He's based in Pennsylvania. He was the lead supporter for Grant Township's efforts in Pennsylvania to resist the dumping of toxic waste. Grant's work has been featured in Rolling Stone, The New Republic, as well as the documentaries Invisible Hand and Hellbent. His work with Grant Township also included drafting the first in the nation rights-based local constitution and the first law legalizing nonviolent direct action to protect rights. In the legislative session, Chad worked with members of the Pennsylvania House of Representatives to introduce an amendment to the Pennsylvania Constitution that would guarantee the right of local community self-government. With colleague Ben Price, Chad has co-authored the Pennsylvania Community Rights Cookbook, a 700-page volume on the history of people's movements and the rise of corporate power in Pennsylvania. Oh, and you began your organizing in Spokane, Washington. In 2009.
Yeah, real quickly, also, since Grant Township was mentioned so much in that, we need to shout out Stacy Long in the room. Stand up, please. Chair of the Board of Supervisors there, and also president of the East Run Hellbender Society, without which that injection well would not have been stopped.
And on my left here, we have Max Wilbert. Max was born in Seattle, Washington, but for nearly a decade has lived in rural western Oregon. That's an inside joke. For 2 decades, Max has been working to save our planet, and this has taken him to the Siberian Arctic, fossil fuel blockades in Canada and the United States, solidarity work with environmentalists in the Philippines, and to the front lines of greenwashing at Thacker Pass, Nevada. He is part of several grassroots political movements, including Fertile Ground Conservancy and Protect Thacker Pass, where he co-founded a land defense camp that held off a major mining corporation for several years. Max is co-author of the book Bright Green Lies, How the Environmental Movement Lost Its Way and What We Can Do About It. That was also turned into a documentary by the same title. His work has been featured in the New York Times, The Guardian, CNN, Last Real Indians, Counterpunch, and elsewhere. The best way, though, to stay updated on his work is to sign up for his Substack page and newsletter. Okay, well, let's get going with some of these questions that we've prepared to start this off. Max, you wrote in your Substack piece, like I said, too many pieces of paper, how journalism protects elites and maintains status quo. And you also wrote 15 tips for speaking to the media. Can you give a brief summary of why you wrote these and felt they were important to get out there?
Okay, so thank you, Tish. It's an honor to be here and an honor to speak to you all. I thought that I was going to be talking during lunch at first, like yesterday, so I was worried that I was going to have to be competing with sandwiches, which is like one of the best food groups ever, so I'm relieved that that's not the case. A little lower pressure on me. So there's an amazing book that I read years ago, written by a man named Gray Bretchen, that's called Imperial San Francisco, Urban Power, Earthly Ruin. And it's looking at one city in particular, San Francisco and the Bay Area by extension, and examining how the city was built as this Rome in the West, as this sort of imperial outpost of the westward march of manifest destiny. So he looks at San Francisco particularly through the lens of media moguls, because William Randolph Hearst, who started many of the big West Coast newspapers, San Francisco Chronicle, I believe, and many others, was this multi-billionaire who created the entire narrative. And so in this book, Gray Bretchen talks about, he gives this great quote that I think sums up the power and the role that mass media plays in our culture today. He says, "The role of media is reinforcing for those on the winning team the comforting dualism of civilization versus barbarism." And that, to me, it ties everything together. So much of what we see in the media, of course there's lies, of course there's outright corruption and these sort of blatant examples of the media serving corporate power. But so much of it happens in the subtlety of how the work is presented, the stories that aren't told, the angles which are presented. I know you're going to ask a question about objectivity, and we're going to get into that topic maybe next. And that, to me, is one of the ways that this plays out. So in this piece about media, I talked about how so many of the greatest journalists throughout history completely fail when it comes to objectivity. They have no objectivity whatsoever. They're not trying to be impartial. They're trying to tell the truth. And the truth is not impartial. It never is. The truth takes a side. And this, to me, is really important. I think that, so one of the reasons, to get back to the question, one of the reasons why I wrote this piece, there are two reasons. One is because understanding the function of media as a primary tool of social control is essential. And I think most people in this room probably already understand that very thoroughly from our own experience. The second reason that I wrote these pieces, the second one is 15 tips for speaking to the media, is because they're here right now and we can't get rid of them like that as much as we would wish that we can. So we have to operate in this reality, knowing that these institutions are fundamentally set up to facilitate the destruction of the planet in many ways. That is their purpose. They serve empire. They serve profit. And by doing what they do, I mean, the New York Times is a $7 billion corporation that's traded on the New York Stock Exchange. They exist to make money, right? They are a corporation. They do not exist to serve the public interest. And if you believe that they do, you're believing a lie that they have constructed, that journalists and media corporations have constructed for their own benefit. Of course, there are a lot of public interest journalists, nonprofit journalists out there, people who are doing work that is in the public interest, And that gets conflated, right? These lines get blurred and things get confused. So I'm looking forward to trying to dive into how we navigate that reality a little more.
Well, since you brought up the balance and objectivity of the media, I think most people engaged in activism of any kind have heard from journalists and media outlets that they have to hear from both sides. I know when I was doing activism in my community of Broadview Heights, that came up a lot, and that they need to be objective. Chris Hedges wrote in 2010 that the creed of objectivity killed the news.
So one of my favorite journalists, one of my personal heroes really, is a man named Dar Jamail. Do people know who that is? Some of you do, I'm sure. Dar Jamail was living in Alaska in the early 2000s, working as a climbing ranger at Denali National Park, rescuing people who did crazy things. And the invasions of Afghanistan and then Iraq took place. And similarly to what we're seeing in Gaza and Palestine now, the only journalism that was taking place in the United States was corporate embedded journalism. It was journalists working for big outlets like ABC and the New York Times and these corporate papers going in embedded with the US troops, working closely with propaganda experts from the military who were trying to tell a certain story to the United States public. And that's what was on TV, that's what was in the papers. And Dar Jamail thought this was BS. And being a person who had no expertise in journalism or training whatsoever, he decided, but being somebody who had an exceptional amount of bravery, you have to have a lot of bravery to climb Denali, he decided to hop on a plane, fly to Iraq, and just start walking around and reporting on what was happening. He ended up spending several years there. It started as basically a newsletter of him emailing his friends, eventually expanded into some support from alternative media and building up a slightly larger platform. And he was one of the few journalists on the ground who was telling the truth about what was happening, contradicting the narrative that was being put forward by the propaganda arm of the US military. There are so many examples of situations like this throughout US history, whether we're talking about Upton Sinclair. I look at somebody like Rachel Carson as being this sort of rogue journalist in a way, somebody who is exposing the truth without training, without credentials, without experience, but somebody who sees a truth that needs to be told and is going to do their best to do that. Rachel Carson's publisher, when she was writing Silent Spring, talked about how her work required an almost religious dedication because she was literally pouring her soul into trying to expose this truth about poisons being dumped en masse across the entire continent and the world, and the effects that these were having. The short version is that I think, in our small group yesterday, Sundance said something about objective is a dirty word. And I wrote that down when you said that because it resonated with me. And I think it's absolutely true. That doesn't mean not reporting on what people say who we disagree with, not telling the truth, not telling the whole truth. But it means approaching it from the reality that we are first human beings. We are first animals, members of this community of life on this planet. And journalist is not this category to reify into some sort of all-important, objective, godly force that is above humanity. Journalism is a job. It is a role that has been created within the society. And I think that when we imbue it with this sort of religious importance of objectivity, then we lose sight of humanity at times.
Thanks, Max. Just a couple other things. One, I'm not sure why I'm up here because I've never had Facebook or Twitter or anything like that. although Will offered to be my first Facebook friend when I get on, so thank you. I appreciate that. Yeah, just a couple other things on that. And most of my experience with the media either comes from me writing very acerbic, mean press releases about corporations or courts or the government on behalf of community groups that I work with. Most of the other experience I have with the media is at the local level, working with communities on different things. So local papers, they use Facebook and things like that. But I don't have a ton of big picture experience like stuff that Max is talking about, although I'm fascinated and think that it's incredibly important to have that understanding. I want to ask a quick question though regarding this objectivity and both sidesism. How many folks in here have been involved in like campaigns or things that have dealt with the media in some way? Okay, most. Do they ever, do they always try to print a different side, a different perspective from the one that you're putting forward? Have you ever seen that they don't do that? Okay. I can tell you I've had one situation in my life in that, and it was a small town newspaper in Northwest Pennsylvania where they would just print my press releases in the newspaper. And that was helpful, but that's probably a once in a lifetime experience. Most of the time, they're printing the opposition side, even though the opposition is normally the one that is heard from. So when we talk about fighting fracking in the newspaper, the stories we get, the community might have a perspective, but the vast majority of the things that are put forward are about the jobs that are created. You don't usually hear about the health risks. And if you do, those are usually given some sort of underhanded treatment of them. That, well, these are just, some bumpkin people in these communities that are worried about fracking or things like that. The studies haven't been borne out. Well, who's paying for the studies that the media is actually publishing? Those are coming from universities that are being published by the oil and gas industry and things like that. So I can go on about this at length, but it sounds like I don't need to because the vast majority of people in here already understand that and have seen that and experienced it. But that is one of the main things that we find when dealing with at least traditional media in our communities is that a lot of people still think there's some objectivity there. And that the both sides do need to be represented to be presented as fair. And that's something that, in my work with communities is about letting them know you don't have to accept that as a premise. You don't have to accept that as the context. You don't have to give the other side a voice because we know what you're doing is right and that you have the evidence and things on your side. It's the difficulty in getting it out because who controls the media most of the time? It's the corporations, the people that these communities are fighting. So that's where more of my perspective comes from. I think it's very much in line with what Max is saying, but I just wanted to give that perspective, and it sounds like I don't need to because everyone else already knows it. Are we taking questions?
Changing the format while I'm up here. Oh my God. Okay, talking about, a lot of the people here have done community activism, so how can the media coverage be used in a way to tell, and we're talking about storytelling here, the truth, all these things, and reckoning, right? So how can the media coverage be used to tell the community's story and further engage, or further their organizing and help the movement of protecting nature? That might fall into some of your tip, but like how have you in your personal experience, I guess, like at Thacker Pass and you with Grant Township, have you been able to use the media?
Yeah, well, it's a good question. It's difficult. I think it's very important to talk to the media, to take opportunities. And I will almost never turn down an opportunity in the context of a campaign to speak with the media, even if they're the corporate media, despite the fact that, in my experience, generally, the more famous the media is, the more of an asshole the journalist is. The New York Times guy I talked to at Thacker Pass was just a total jerk. Cold, very cold. But anyway, that's beside the point. I think it's important when you're thinking about this, have folks seen the sort of spectrum of allies tool that's commonly used? It's a pretty simple idea that you can, in any sort of campaign, you can visualize a spectrum of allies. So imagine yourself and your close allies, the people that you're working with at the center. And that's the people who agree with you, pretty much exactly. You have the same goals, and you're working towards the same projects. On the next level out from that, you have the people and the organizations, the institutions that are mostly aligned with you. There's some significant overlap, but they might have reservations. They're not totally on board. These are maybe your passive allies. Then you might have people who are sympathetic, but they're not really willing to take any action at this point. Then you have people who are completely neutral. Then you have people who are sort of passively opposed to you. Then you have your active opposition, right? So it's a spectrum from people who you're aligned completely with to those who you're completely opposed to on this topic. And the goal of any campaign, or perhaps more accurately, a strategy in any campaign, is to pull people along that spectrum. So, of course, it's useful to try and get people to be your exact allies and be right with you and work with you. But it's also useful to pull people from being passively opposed to you to being neutral. Like, that's a victory for your campaign if you can make that happen. And so that's one way I try to look at media work, is that we're trying to create a magnetism, and we're trying to pull people, organizations, and institutions along that spectrum. We're trying to disarm and defuse our opponents to make them doubt the morality of their own actions in actively opposing us. We're trying to move people who are on the fence to think, you know what, they make some good points. These people are articulate, they've got good facts, they've got good information, they're making sense, right? And we're trying, of course, to get people to really join us in actively taking action. And the way that we speak to media is gonna differ depending on what audience we're accessing through that media. So the way that we speak to or converse with some alternative media who are part of the movement, who mostly have the same politics that we do, is gonna be completely different than a big corporate media production, ABC or something like that. We know that ABC likely, not always, but often, is going to make activists look pretty stupid. If they have a chance, they're likely to try and do that, whether intentionally or just out of sort of negligence and not understanding the politics that are behind it. And so one of the tips that I have in here is about message discipline. That gets incredibly important when you're talking to corporate media and bigger media. Literally, I was trained when you go on an interview that might be in any way oppositional, have 3 points that you want to make, and do not say anything else other than those 3 points, no matter what questions they ask you. Because if you say one thing that is remotely, kind of stupid or inarticulate or off topic, they will use that and not the other brilliant things that you said right before and right after, right? So that's what I was trained, is in an oppositional situation with an interview, only say what you've prepared ahead of time, what you've practiced, the most important messages of your campaign, and leave it at that. Whereas, if I'm doing an interview, or you're doing an interview with a podcast of somebody who's sympathetic, right, you might talk for an hour about the details of organizing and get into a much more informal dialogue about it. So that's one way to think of this that has been helpful for me, at least.
Thanks. Max, I just wanted to add quick there. I know I've seen that often with the communities I've worked in. We're activists, we're so eager, right? We're so passionate about what we're doing that we want to talk to any media contact, and we're so anxious to pour our hearts out to them. And then you see the story come out in print, and you're like, oh my God, did I really say that? Yeah, I see heads nodding. Yeah, and so that's why Max's 15 tips are really helpful, I think, to try and think about it first and what you want to say. And so to Chad, I want to ask you, because different perspective. I forgot to mention, too, that you are a journalism major. You had a journalism degree, right? Kind of?
Almost. I changed it at the end.
Okay.
But I was in journalism school for quite a while.
Right. So there is some background there. But, the original question was about telling the community story. So I know you have a lot of experience with that. And how do you advise them with that?
Yeah, I think it's different on which media we're talking about. Max made the distinction between large corporate media, which are always assholes for the most part, versus like smaller town newspapers or other different, online publications and things like that. So I think it is important to distinguish between which media we're talking about. It's not a homogeneous thing, and a lot of times media just gets caught up as media, but it's not all media. I agree with Max. I usually have kind of two pieces of advice I start with communities. One is don't say anything that you would not want to see in print and stick to that. With that said, who in here has had something printed that they did not say or was taken out of context? Mm-hmm. Yeah. So even though it's a good rule to have, it doesn't always mean that that's what's going to get put in the paper or online or wherever. The other thing that I usually follow up with that is when that happens, don't freak out either. It's not the end of the world. You're going to have all kinds of opposition. And because usually if people see something misquoted or it's not how they wanted it to be presented, there's a lot of consternation, and it takes away from other activities or things they could be doing to actually get their message out in other ways, rather than just worrying about that one piece that was not representative of their voice or their vision. One other thing I wanted to say on that is there's a danger sometimes, I think, in focusing too much on getting media coverage. As if we just get these many newspapers or this many journalists or this much coverage, that somehow is going to solve the problem for us or fix what it is that we're trying to fix. There's an outsized focus, in my opinion, on the media sometimes in terms of the effect that it will have on their campaign. And it takes time and energy away from other things they could be doing that would be more effective. So did you want me to get at something else there, Tish, or was that?
Well, no, I mean, I think we're talking about storytelling a lot and advising the community. So one of the things I know, since we're a public interest law firm, we have a lot of briefs and court decisions and things like that. And I think a lot of times we think of it, but I'm not sure other people do, that those can be used to tell a story. And how do you do that? And I know, Max, you've also been involved in some court cases. So how can they, because it seems like a lot of our communities get so involved with the legal aspect of things, but they see them as these detailed legal documents instead of a way to tell a story.
Yeah, I think that depends on what the community's outcome is as well, and whether they believe that the courts are going to side with them if you do get a lawyer and you do take something to court. At the Legal Defense Fund, we have, for the most part, abandoned thinking that any court is going to side with the community at the local level at this point. That stuff doesn't usually change until there's a mass movement of grassroots support that pushes the law upwards to change. So from our perspective, we stopped advising communities to think that the courts were actually going to get them what they want, and we started engineering our briefs on behalf of the community that was about defending the community's right to self-govern and to be free from things like fracking or free from things like the dumping of sewage sludge. But then engineering the court cases to actually get the court to say what it is that the community and the public needs to understand about what the role of the court is, which is not to be an impartial judge, which is not to be on the side of the community, but is actually there to oppress and try to punch down the community. We don't like to do that with communities just for the sake of having them not get their case either heard by the court or having won the case, but we do it as a part of an educational process. Because if people still think that the courts are going to be there to help them, they will go back in there time and time again in ways that drain energy and resources, and eventually end up they don't get what they want, they're poor, they haven't seen their family in however many years. And so we try to use these court cases to educate communities on what's actually happening with the courts, what are their priorities and their values. And so, yeah, we use that kind of stuff to help educate. And that's been a large part of our work over the last 10 or 15 years. But frankly, and this goes, I think, to some of the stuff that Will was talking about yesterday, if people get educated and they understand how the system and the courts work at that point, it doesn't mean they're going to have the will or the energy or the resources to carry on. It's a long process. And it actually, sometimes, it hurts people deep enough that they get discouraged and they go away. So we're trying at this point to get away from the courts as much as possible. We have used it in the past as an educational tool. But ideally, we'd have people on the streets that are simply protecting and enforcing their rights and the rights of nature without having to rely on the courts to do it or without having to rely on other groups or organizations to do it. That's where we would like people to get to. The difficulty, and I think this is also something that Will talked about yesterday, is having people have that level of knowledge and understanding and training to be able to go around the existing institutions, whether it's the court or the state or federal government or whatever it is, and just do the work that they need to do in order to protect their communities and secure their own rights. In many ways, that's what happened in Grant Township with the law that legalized nonviolent direct action. They had a law in place that banned a fracking injection well. They got sued twice in federal court by the corporation. They were sued in state court by the State Department of Environmental Protection. The State Department of Environmental Protection sued them for trying to protect their environment. So at that point, Grant Township was like, well, we're getting sued in all these ways. The state is basically telling us we have no other options here. So how are we going to protect our charter? How are we going to protect our rights? And the answer to that was not to sit back and just say we have no options here. The answer to that was to continue pushing ahead and say, if y'all tell us we can't protect our rights, then we're going to allow our residents and other people from other places to come in here and legally go into the street and block the trucks, because that's the last resort that we have. And we will use our local resources to protect those people. So it was about continuing to escalate the fight with the state and with the corporations and with the courts. And it never came to that, fortunately, but they felt that that was as far as they had to go. So it's about, we use the courts to educate, but if the community is also not willing to go beyond what the courts tell you, then a lot of times communities just go away. So that's the challenge I feel like in our work right now, is trying to figure out how to get people beyond trying to rely on the institutions and just rely on themselves and what they know is right for their community.
Did you want to add anything, Max?
Yeah, well, I completely agree. I think that there's this mythology that in part comes from what I was talking about earlier about the myth of objectivity and this sort of reified idea of the journalist as this amazing, important role in society that's the defender of truth and democracy. And part of the mythology around that is that if we just educate, that there will magically be transformation in systems of power and there will be some sort of revolutionary change and everything will be okay. To my mind, that's missing a step completely. Outside the door here is Frederick Douglass, who, as many of you probably know, has this amazing quote writing about slavery where he said, power concedes nothing without a demand. It never has and it never will. The whole quote is, let's see, he says, the struggle to fight slavery may be a moral one or a physical one or both, but it will be a struggle. Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never has and it never will. That's one of the most important political thinkers in American history. And if you believe that simply educating and changing people's mind, I'm not saying that's not important, it's incredibly important. But changing the oppression that we see in the world today, the destruction of the planet, these things are not mistakes. They're not happening because people have not been properly educated and they're accidentally destroying the planet. It's deliberately being done, right? It's a deliberate process. And the people who are making these decisions, who have the power to control most of these decisions, are among the most powerful people in our society and on the planet. And those people fight to defend their interests. They fight in all kinds of different ways, whether it's the type of lawsuits that you were talking about, Chad, or in many different ways, right? I have friends who are environmentalists in the Philippines. You mentioned that I've traveled and worked with folks there who are right now fighting a gold mining corporation, and their lives are at risk just for speaking out, just for telling the truth about pollution and the destruction of the land. And they have friends who have disappeared, just gone, yeah. And this happens all over the world. The United States, we have, thanks to the struggles and the sacrifices of people who came before, we have some protections for free speech, for civil rights, for activists, very imperfect, very partial protections. But to my mind, that should empower us to go even further and push us to be more bold and more confrontational in our actions. Because if we just focus on the education alone, we skip the part about confrontation with power. And that's where the change actually happens. The education is a shaping action that helps get us towards that future. But if we skip the confrontation part, then we're not going to get where we need to go. And it's not easy, it's scary, it's difficult work, it's dangerous work, but I think that's really important to do.
Okay. Do you have any, I mean, I feel like we're like media bashing here. So like, how about, yeah, well, let's be objective here and balanced, right? You know? Well, no, I was going to ask them if they had any examples of media actually being useful in a campaign or to a community. You know, how did that come about? I know I have one. It has to do with the Lake Erie Bill of Rights, but that's why we're here today, because media actually picked up that story. And I think it's because it was so novel. You know, it was a first. I mean, the firsts a lot of times get media attention. And I think the community, like, you have to be ready to use that because we're not used to it. It doesn't happen very often. And that you have to be able to really, like, jump on that and use it. So if either of you two have examples of that, too, because that might help, you know, if you share those stories for other organizers to see that.
Sure. So when we went to Thacker Pass, we wanted to stop this mining project, but a secondary goal that we set for ourselves from the beginning was to shift the culture of activism and shift the understanding of lithium mining as a source of raw materials for electric car batteries and energy storage batteries, and to challenge this idea that this so-called green technology is actually green, to show people what's behind an electric car. There may be less greenhouse gas emissions, but there's destroyed mountains, there's desecrated sacred sites, there's workers exploited, there's this whole trail of harms from a supply chain all around the world, from, you know, cobalt mining in the Congo to nickel mining in Indonesia on uncontacted indigenous peoples' territories, and on and on and on. And I think that in the first goal, we have not been successful. Thacker Pass is being destroyed as we speak. The bulldozers are rolling. They started rolling last year. And we went out and tried to stop them with direct action. And myself and Will, who was up here yesterday, and a bunch of other folks are facing a lawsuit as a result of that. But in terms of the second goal, I think we have had some significant success. We're seeing a backlash to that success right now. We're seeing the mainstream climate movement and the mainstream big environmental movement pushing back strongly, trying to undermine this powerful story that we built. And that's going to what you said, Tish. Humans are storytelling creatures. We're motivated and carried forward by story. And so if we can find a compelling new way to talk about and convey the stories of the campaigns we're trying to push forward, the changes that we're trying to make in the world, that moves people. It can profoundly move people. But if we tell the same old stories in the same old ways that they've been told before, it doesn't hit the mark. You know, it doesn't change people. So I think it takes a lot of attention to detail. It takes sitting down and being very deliberate about what's the story we're trying to create, and how do our actions and the sequence of steps we're going to take in our campaign, how do they feed into a narrative and a story? Because you know, it all works together. It all is part of a cohesive process, I think.
Yeah, I think there's a couple layers of that for me. One is, I mean, like with Libor, there was so much media on that, international media, and that's, I believe as you said, helped to shift minds. There's been cultural change. It's educated people. It helped, you know, accelerate other instances of rights of nature work getting done, not just in the U.S. but around the world. In Grant Township, they've been featured in international media as well. One of the bigger pieces was Rolling Stone. And, you know, that didn't end up stopping the injection well. Like, those kinds of stories don't actually stop the harm. It's the hard work of the people on the ground. But what it did do is it helped legitimize their effort in some ways. People said, oh, this isn't some group of crazy hicks from, you know, Western Pennsylvania. They were like, oh, maybe they're not so crazy. Maybe this is a story that is worth paying more attention to. It helped legitimize. It also helped them fundraise, helped CELDF fundraise. So, you know, there is benefit, I think, to pieces like that that are done well. So it's not for naught. I think the more practical level is more local papers. It's not the best, but it's easier to build relationships with some of the reporters there that can get you better coverage if you develop relationships with them over time. That's not true in all cases. I'm Youngstown folks, I know, with the Vindicator, probably never, yeah. Yeah, so it's not true in all cases, but it is more accessible with local papers that can get you better coverage and get you some cover at least for your effort. And I mean, the last piece for me when it comes to like getting the story out and media coverage is communities have to create their own media. I mean, it's been like that throughout our country and, you know, every other country's history, is we don't own the printing presses for the most part, or at least the big ones. We don't, you know, own a lot of stuff. And so we have to figure out how to get our message out independent of the existing institutions. And, you know, it's a lot of the work that people just don't want to do, but it's going door to door. It's sending out postcards. It's getting on the phone with people. It's you know, doing your websites or other social media these days as well. But it's really the hard work, the long-term work, the work of relationship building. Nobody wants to go knock on their neighbor's door, but that's what like has to happen in talking with people, and it works. It just means that there has to be a concerted effort to do that. And so it's about, you know, whatever cause you care about. You may not be able to rely on other local media or anything else. You've got to figure out how to get your message out and change minds on your own, because nobody else is going to do it for you. I mean, that's the bleak part from my perspective. But when the communities take it up, it can be really effective.
Thank you, Max. Thank you, Chad.
Thank you, Tish.
Hope you guys enjoyed this roundtable.